All right, all right. Thank you so much for joining me again today. Today is day 6, week number 2 of working in the little journal. So, if you're tuning in live or if you're watching the recording, awesome. Really appreciate you being here. If you are live and you want to pop into the comments and say hi, and great to hear from you and see who is out there and where you are tuning in from. Um, I'll probably just give folks another minute or so just to make sure that people can find us here. Um, but anyway, so just to kind of recap, in case you are just catching this for the first time, all this month during May, I am coming live here on Facebook, um, working in a little journal, just a 3.5 by 5.5 inch Stillman and Burn heavy duty mixed media journal. It's their Zeta series. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Stillman and Burn has like an entire series or different series actually of their books. And I've got their little wrapper here. So they have an alpha, a beta, a gamma, delta, epsilon, and zeta. I have used the alpha, the epsilon, and now the zeta. So the zeta has a nice heavy mixed media paper. So anyway, so I've been working in that, and I've been kind of thinking about the theme of emergence, even though I have not really used words or things like that in my book. I'm slowly kind of building up to that. So um, anyway, so today was kind of thinking like, okay, what am I going to get into? I've worked with kind of getting pages started, building some different layers, and then last time there on Friday, I started incorporating some collage, some things to kind of start to suggest meaning. Like I said, I'm working with this theme, emergence, and it's something I don't really have an idea of what I want to do. I don't have this thing pictured in my mind like, oh, this is what this is going to be. The way I work is very intuitive, and the ideas sort of build as I work. So that's kind of where I am. I'm like, I want to start sort of gearing my work more toward the message and the meaning and things that I'm putting in there. I don't want it just to be like, oh, here's a bunch of art techniques. I want it to have sort of some more specificity to it, and working toward this theme and how I do that. So um, anyway, like this is very different from me. I mean, different for me. I'm so used to working in a big journal where it's a documentation of me, of my everyday life, of the art that I'm making, of the ideas that I'm thinking. And this is very different. This is very much keyed to a very specific thing. So um yeah, in a way I feel like I'm struggling a bit just to kind of, or maybe not struggling, but maybe a little bit afraid. I think that's it. I think just a little bit of fear of like committing, like, oh, what if I mess this up? So it's that a little bit of that inner critic. So trying to sort of push through that, I think, is part of the process, part of the kind of dealing with something so specific. Whereas whenever I'm working in the big journal, I'm not being very specific, so I jump around a lot. But with this little book, I do want it to be more specific. So anyway, today I thought, well, let me get out my stencils and work with this some stencils that I have. Now, here's the thing. I know a lot of artists, they have a huge stash of stencils, and there are several companies out there that put out these sort of stencils that are designed by artists. I know that Stencil Girl is one of it. Mary Beth Shaw, she does it, and there's all kinds of other companies out there that like kind of give out, or not give out, but have created very specific stencils and have had different artists design stencils for them. And I think that's awesome. But for me, though, personally, it's like, well, I don't want to use somebody else's art. I'd much rather kind of use either very generic stencils or things that I've actually created. So if I'm using stencils that are image based, they're usually things that I've created. Or I find a lot of things that I use as stencils, and I'll share some of that. But I like generic stencils, like letter stencils and things like that. So that's what I'm going to be using. But you use whatever you want. And like I said, you can kind of work along and kind of uh, take what I do for cues for your work, or you could just be doing something totally different. And I would love to see if you've been working on something, whether it's related to what I've been doing or completely not. I still would love to kind of see what you have been doing. You can always leave, take a photo and post that here in the comments, or you can post it on social media and tag me, and that way I can see it. So anyway, let's go ahead and I'm going to switch it over and talk about what I'm going to be working with and sort of the reason behind it. So as always, if you want to say hi in the comments, it's always great to see who is out there watching. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, that's cool as well. And of course, if you ever have any questions or comments, or if you want to see certain things, or you want me to talk about certain things, please feel free to put those in the comments. So anyway, let me go ahead and switch this over. All right, so I've got, of course, my little journal. I've got some of my brushes, and I pulled out the cards, the index cards, where I was doing a little bit of the brainstorming there last week. So I think it was Tuesday that I've kind of done that, but just to sort of have this in the background, because I may or may not use some of the images or some of the words or some of the thoughts that are on that, but just kind of have that. I'm going to push it off to the side, but and then I've got a pile of stencils here, and some of them are specifically stencils and some of them I use them as stencils. So right off the bat, I have 3 different sizes of what I call punchinella, just because that's what I've heard it called. And it's basically sequin waste. So when they make sequins, so there's like small, medium, kind of large. And so it's the what's left after it. And they used to, I guess they still do, but they would package it as a ribbon. And it's hard to find. Like you can't just walk into a craft store and say, oh, I want punchinella. Like I said, sometimes you can find it as a ribbon. And I think people buy it on eBay a lot. eBay and Etsy are good places to get it. But I like it because it was stencil waste. And 20 years ago, when somebody gave this to me, it was pretty easy to find. A lot of people had it. Nowadays, it's a little bit harder to find. But I just like it because it's a very generic kind of pattern that can be stenciled. And actually some companies make sort of a punchinella stencil, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so I might use that. I also, one of my other favorite stencils is plastic mesh, also known as plastic canvas. And you might know this as something you stitch yarn through. And so you can buy it in these little shapes. There's squares, hearts. They used to have stars. I don't know if they still do or not, but I have some circles lying around as well. But it's great to get this kind of grid texture, this grid pattern. And then I've got some different lettering stencils. Oh, I almost forgot this one. This one was really interesting. I got this in North Carolina from a place called the Scrap Exchange. And I think they're still going strong down there. But a lot of cities, a lot of places, it's basically they buy all this like stuff, kind of what some people might consider junk or trash, and then they sell it. And this was just sort of, I like the holes in it. And so this has become a stencil. I'm not sure exactly what it was originally for, but I definitely use it as a stencil. So these kind of found stencils are kind of interesting. But then I do have some of my different lettering stencils, and I've got some bigger ones over here out of frame. So some thin, flexible stencils, as well as some thicker, heavier duty stencils that I might use. So anyway, I think I'll start off with probably some of these and a couple different ways that I can use them. I really, hopefully, as you can tell, either from watching this or being familiar with my artwork, I love layers, and I just love building up these layers, and I love texture and pattern. So these are great for creating all of that. So like flipping through, I just kind of feel like, oh, this could use something else. So I'll take this kind of medium stencil here. And now I use watercolor. Okay. I use the Inktet's actually technically not watercolor, but act just like watercolor. And I know a lot of folks are like, but that doesn't make sense to use that with stencils because it's real watery. It's going to run. It's going to bleed. But I really like that. That's part of the thing that I like about it. So get a little bit of water and a little bit of paint. If you don't want it to bleed so much, if you're using the watercolor or Inktense or something that's really watery, then don't have so much water in your brush. And the other thing that you could do is you could use a sponge. If you use a sponge, you can get the paint in it, but you dampen the sponge and you squeeze out all the water so that there's not a whole lot of water in the brush or in the sponge. Load up the sponge with the paint, and then you could tap it. So I just kind of paint this on, and let it bleed. It probably won't bleed so much where the paper is, where that text is, and I just kind of do it haphazardly, and kind of creates this really interesting texture. It reminds me of bubble wrap. That's another thing I like to use, but bubble wrap is more about stamping. So anyway, so that's a kind of a cool texture, and it's not super wet, so I'm not even going to worry about using a hair dryer. But you can see like where there's some places where the dots kind of disappear and kind of bleed in, but I really like that. So maybe I'll switch it up over here and use some of the smaller one. But if you're using acrylic paint's a little bit thicker, less likely to kind of run or bleed underneath the stencil. And you could use, especially if you're using acrylic, you could use a stencil brush. A stencil brush has short little stiff bristles that allow you to kind of tap into the stencil. But with these real thin stencils, I tend to just brush the paint on. Now this paint isn't going to really stick too much to the magazine image that I have down. It might a little bit, but just gives it some texture. What's nice about this kind of starting off today with this is that this gives me time to think. I mean, I haven't really given this little journal much thought over the weekend. I was busy doing yard work and stuff, so I didn't even really do any artwork over the weekend. So this hasn't really been on my mind. And so kind of coming back to it today, it's sort of like, okay, let me ease into it. And so this just allows me to kind of get back to work. I always like that Chuck Close quote. He says, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work." So this is a way to show up and get to work and not worry too much about trying to create the meaning yet. But as I work, then that can start to happen. Okay, so I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to move into my plastic mesh. This mesh is a little bit thicker. So I'm not just going to be able to brush it on like I did with the thinner stencils. So I'm going to get a little bit of paint, and then I want to poke, basically kind of just up and down. So I'm holding my brush perpendicular. I'm not going to paint it. And what I'm going to do is just kind of poke it in. And I don't know if you can hear sort of that little tapping sound as I am tapping into those little holes, because that mesh is kind of thick. And I'm not going to do every single little hole. If I can pick it up, I've got this texture. They do sell, of course, they sell this in really big sheets, and I have some of that, but I love this size because I can take it with me anywhere. And so it just fits in really well and into a bag and I can take it with me. Not that I've really gone anywhere over the last year. One day though. Okay, so just kind of tap it. And when I did it, I lined it up so that way it can look like it's one continuous thing. Um, One of the bad habits I have is I don't clean these off. And so often, like, I just use this dark blue. That dark blue is going to dry on there. And then whenever I go to use it again, it's going to pick up and, maybe contaminate the color. But I kind of like that. I like that sort of not knowing exactly what it's going to look like. If that bothers you, you can always rinse them off and wipe them off with a paper towel. But I rinsed out my brush because when I do this, I often end up with sort of puddles of paint and water. Um, where the paint is pretty much dried, it's going to be pretty fixed. That's the nice thing about these Inktense paints is that they don't lift up as easily as watercolor. And so I can sort of paint over them and just it's going to spread out the kind of puddles, but it's also just going to soften that paint a little bit. It lifts up a little bit. But that's a nice way. It really kind of helps push that piece of fodder, that collage in there. Okay. Just like everything, I don't need to do it on every single page or every single spread. And I want to move into my letter stencils and my primarily numbers. I like using letters and numbers to sort of give a hint of some kind of meaning. Because we recognize letters, we recognize numbers, and so if I can take something like this and stencil it on, it's like I'll see that as a number and it's like, okay, there's something there to be read, but not really. It's just numbers. There's no real reason for it. I got my little scrap paper. This is the paper that I use. I stuck underneath when I painted a circle that I'd cut out. So I don't want to get paint through my window. So I can, of course, can put a scrap piece of paper. And I love using the same paper over and over again because then it gets this buildup of different things. So I could paint this, but I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to pull out my water-soluble pencils. So I used a lot of that fuchsia color. But what I found is that there's another color that I use a lot that I like. It's like a darker, this is called Deep Rose. Another reason I like the ink, I like a big set, should I say, of water-soluble pencils and such, is that you kind of can get a variety of color, and sometimes it's like you get lighter and darker versions of the same color. So this Deep Rose is sort of like a darker fuchsia color, I think, if I remember correctly. And so I'm gonna trace the outside of the numbers. And I'm really gonna press hard and I'm gonna put down a lot of pigment. So this is using the letters and the numbers and just using them as more of a decoration, more of a visual element. Like I said, it kind of hints at some kind of meaning or some kind of message, but it's kind of like the images and the collage that I used last time, that it's not explicit. It doesn't say emerge, even though I might use that word emerge or emergence at some point, and I'm pretty sure I will. Okay. So I just like that kind of that visual reference to the numbers. I'm going to soften it. Just going to take my paintbrush with a little bit of water. Just going to spread that out. Because I pressed pretty hard, that's going to allow the pigment to spread a little bit, but also it's not going to totally disappear. Okay. So that just it's numbers, so we kind of like how we think about language, but of course we kind of wonder like why are there numbers? Is it a count down, a count up? Um, it just sort of implies something, but doesn't explicitly state anything. And just kind of flipping through, just wondering like, oh, do I want to put anything over top of the stencil that I did? And we can do the same thing with letters. I mean, this has numbers on it too, but just thinking about the letters here. And let me go ahead and get out. I'm going to use my Inktense again. Yeah, I'll use that. Sharpen it. And this stencil, the letters are pretty thin, so I'm just going to sort of color in the stencil just to make the letter kind of thick, pressing pretty hard. Again, I want to get down a lot of pigment. I want to press hard, make it nice and dark. That way it's going to spread. I could do this with ink, and then, it's just going to be ink. It won't spread or anything. I don't need to paint over it. I can do it with marker. I could do it with paint. This is a thick stencil, so it would be harder to do it with the paint, but just like I did with that plastic mesh, I could sort of poke and stab. Okay. I could do others, but I kind of just usually like to do a line. And again, we see it's the alphabet. And so it implies language, but it's not blatantly saying a word. And so it implies language, and so we kind of see it more as like part of the background. Again, I'm always just sort of flipping back and forth. Number one, that gives that a little bit of time to dry. But also just to kind of think like, do I want to have more? And actually, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn to this, and I just kind of feel like, oh, it'd be kind of cool to have it go sideways. Another reason I like the little journal, it's easy to turn, work on it from different angles. So I've turned it and, put that across. I think what I'm going to do, let me pull out a pen. Let's see, which one is this? Okay, this is a dark blue. And I haven't used this color before, so I don't even know what it looks like. So I'm going to use the pen this time and just outline. So when I use the pen, it's like this. I know this is going to be a dark blue. So the numbers should show up, but they're not going to be like super dark. They're not going to like be really super bold, especially because I know that this is a very thin line. And yeah, I mean, they kind of disappear. So I'm going to show you a way to kind of maybe bring it back if that's important. So right now, maybe it's not important that I could read that. But if I decide that it is, and I think I do, I think I want that to stand out a little bit more, and it'll allow me to bring a little bit more color to it. I'm going to pull out my pencils. Let's see, what color do I want? That's the real question. You know what? Let's use. So I have a violet, but it's a very dark violet. But I have this. No, I don't want it. That's dusky purple. That's kind of a darkish purplish color. I thought I had. Oh, I do. It's in here. I know exactly which color I need. This one. It's called Thistle. Needs sharpened. So let me sharpen it. So this is kind of, it's a purpley color, but it's a little bit more, has a little bit more red in it. And so what I'm going to do, one of my favorite techniques with the any water-soluble pencil is to shade around the outside. I mean, I've done this before, but I did it with shapes. But to do it with letters and numbers is a great way to sort of pull out or emphasize the letters and the numbers. Actually, just anything. Like if you had just a silhouette or a stencil or something, you drew a person, a figure, but they kind of blend into the background. You could take this technique and shade around into the negative space. So this is very, very much like negative painting, which is probably, you can kind of think of it as like, you've painted down all this different color, and then you want to have a figure stand out on it, but you want the figure to be the color of the background, and you want to do something to the background. A lot of times people use white. So then they'll paint white around the figure or the flower or the shape. And so it'll cover up the background, but the white makes it contrast. It's a contrast in value, a contrast in intensity. So just by doing that, you can see how the numbers really start to stand out more. Okay. And then I've got just a small round brush that I can then work in and get around and into all like little crevices of the number. Just paint it around. So I always kind of think of this as kind of playing around with word art in like Microsoft Word. And I don't even know if they still have that feature or not, but where you could give word and such shadows, and depending on like the direction of the shadow and the spread of the shadow, It's kind of like what I'm doing. It's kind of like I'm putting this purpley shadow all around the numbers, and they kind of spread out. But it just darkens the area around it, makes the letter or number in this case stand out. So whether it's a square like I've done before, or a number or a letter, just makes it stand out. Just giving that a moment to dry. So I think I'm going to go back to this first page, because I do want to start creating the meaning, and I do want to kind of think about what I want this to say, because words are just as important as the images, just as important as the color. And I want to start here, and I'm going to do something that I do a lot of in my big journals. A lot of times in my big journals, the very first page is an I am page. And I do that in my big journals as kind of almost like a introduction, sort of like a title page. But I thought I'd do it here, number one, to sort of reference that I do that in the big journal, but then also just to kind of thinking about that idea of emergence. You know, that's something that's very specific to me, and it's all about me, and something about personal growth, I think, is really what it's about. And so I think kind of starting this book with that notion of I am. I'm thinking I'm going to put it right down here. It's a little damp, so I think I'm going to hit it with the hairdryer. So I'll mute it, and then I will dry it, and then I'll add it. Okay. Yeah, the hairdryer really makes things curl. So the cover is kind of curled, but anyway. All right, so I've got these smaller, thinner stencils. So I'm gonna go. So this is the pen that I use to kind of draw some of the lines in the background. So I think just right down here. Now, sometimes people have asked, like, do I draw in guidelines, or, how do I make sure that everything lines up with the stencils? I like the plastic ones because they are see-through. Sometimes though, they get covered with paint and they're not so see-through. But I don't use any kind of guidelines. Of course, if you want to, basically you can use a ruler or any kind of straight edge and just draw in a line with a pencil. The only problem is with the mixed media that it's hard to erase the pencil and have it totally disappear. A lot of times what happens is you do lift up what's underneath. So if I were to take an eraser and go on top of the paint and the water-soluble pencil, it could pick it up a little bit and lighten it. So anyway, but there's the I. And what I'm doing is I kind of do a little scribbly mark. And I think, let's see. Yeah, I'm going to do lowercase. And, you know, it's like I can see where the eye is. Okay, I'll approximate. A lot of times I can line up a letter with the bottom of the previous letter. So here with that cent mark, that cent symbol, I can line that up with the bottom of the eye. And then when I do this, I just sort of scribble, and I just kind of scribble real fast, and it creates this textured kind of, it doesn't color it in solid, it's a little just more of a texture. Okay, so I, A, and then the M. And so I can see, I don't know if you can see it, but I can see like the A is right there. That's where the little tail of the A is. And so, you know, that's a good spacing. The one, I do have a word of advice whenever you're stenciling words. You might want to write the word out, at least on a piece of scrap paper, because I know I am notorious for stenciling words and completely misspelling them. Usually I skip a letter, or even whenever I draw. And I think it's just in part because you're using a different part of your brain. I mean, they talk about, you know, the right side, left side of your brain. So we often think of the right side as like the creative side, and the left side as the analytical side. And so when you're spelling, that's a very analytical thing. But whenever you're stenciling or drawing, that's more of a spatial creative thing. And so yeah, sometimes I lose track and totally misspell words, but I'm pretty safe with I am. So anyway, so that what that does now is I am, and then I can think, I don't know exactly what yet though, but now this will probably have some kind of word or writing on it. But this gives me a starting point. I am, you know, and maybe it is I am emerging, or I am breaking out. I am becoming. You know, there's all these like phrases that are starting to kind of come up. So as I'm working, then I can be like, okay, I am, and I can kind of think about that stuff. So, but I'm still not quite sure. So I've kind of started that process. What will happen, and I find this happens all the time, as I'm working, all of a sudden, like things will click, and it'd be like, ah, okay, now I know the direction I want to go. Now I'm getting it. So anyway, so I'm going to go back to kind of working more generically, thinking about what I want to put down. So here's a good spot. I'm going to turn to the big Punchinella, and I like to use this. I mean, I use it with paint, I use it with ink, but I'm going to use it with the pencil. All right, let's see. So I have a color here called mustard, just like the condiment mustard, and it goes on kind of dark. So that's the other thing with the Inktense pencils, is that it's really hard to get a sense of what they're going to look like until you paint the water on them. And that's another way they kind of differ from watercolor pencils. So sometimes you'll look at the tip and you'll be like, oh, okay, that's the color it is. You draw it down and you're like, oh, okay, I like that color. Then you paint over it and then it changes. So you'll see how this will change whenever I paint water over it. And it's just that water-soluble ink. But what I've used these so much that I know what it's going to look like. I know the color it's going to turn out, and sort of like, you know, what it goes with. So again, you kind of look at that and you're like, okay, that's pretty dark. So I like doing this, gives a little bit of a texture and helps just create another, yeah, just creates another layer, another texture, and then when I brush it over, so when I brush it over, it really, the color really comes alive. It kind of lightens up a little bit, gets a little bit brighter. And I think I'll do the same thing over here, at least on the top part of this. So this is just giving me more time to kind of think about the direction that I want the words and the text to go. I love to use this one with ink, just because it's a thicker stencil. A little harder to use it with the watercolor, or I do use it with the water-soluble pencils, but just find it's a little bit easier to do it with ink. I think I'm going to do one here. So I'm not going to do every circle. I don't have that enough patience for that. Some people will, though. I like that reference to a repeated pattern. So it's repeated enough that you can kind of see a pattern, but it's not. It's a little bit uneven and irregular. And like I've kind of been doing throughout is thinking about, okay, I did these little circles here, and then if I repeat them over here, then those pages start to tie together. It's just a visual vocabulary. And so if you're really thinking about, kind of how can you tie pages together, this is one way, just that repetition. So Francis is asking about how to add a photo to the comments. That's a good question. It depends on if you're using your phone or your, I'm thinking like whenever you click into where it hit reply or just comment, usually there pops up if you want to add something like a photo. Just like you can kind of add a photo whenever you post to Facebook. Should be something kind of similar. I could be totally wrong. Yeah, that's a good question. If anybody knows the answer to that question. I've done it before, I know that. I think it might be easier on a phone. So anyway. Yeah, so just did a little bit more of that punchinella just to kind of create more texture. And these, I haven't really worked too much on these, but it's one of those things where I'm kind of really establishing what's happening up front. So kind of feel like I want to establish kind of the direction of things before kind of continuing too much back here, because then that might, as I'm working, that might be influenced by the direction that I want to go, and it'll give me like kind of more possibilities. So anyway, but I think I kind of going to wrap it up for today. But I just, it starts to add richness. I always think about the layering process as a way to add richness to pages. So just, on here, I had the image, I had a whole bunch of stuff going on, but today I added the numbers, the words, and the little circles. And it really just kind of helps, again, to add some richness and some layers to it. Even like this, just those numbers there really, they pop out, stand out a little bit, kind of hint at language and, account or, something, not explicit yet. So, yeah, so I think that's going to wrap it up for today. So yeah, I'm slowly sort of easing into, or not even really easing into it. I'm slowly figuring out what I want this little book to be about. Yeah, I have that theme. I've had that theme since I started. So here I am a week later, and I want to I want to start thinking about the direction of the meaning, the message. What is this little book about? And it's a different feeling than working in my big book, because my big book is like, oh, I just throw everything in there and things sort of come up. And so this is very different. I'm trying to navigate, trying to figure things out as I work. So it's a little bit scarier. And of course, that inner critic comes up, and that's part of it. I think that might be one of the reasons why I'm not like diving in with the words and the things yet, because there's a part of me that's like, oh, I don't want to mess it up. So anyway, yeah, so hopefully you're enjoying this. I know some of you are showing up every day or most days, so, and I appreciate that. Again, if you got questions or comments, please pop them into the comments, and I'll be back here tomorrow, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And yeah, we'll figure out, because I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do tomorrow. So anyway, so thank you so much for tuning in again. And like I said, let me know if you need anything or have any questions, and I will see you tomorrow. So as always, happy creating.